Let's take a second to look at some basic sentence structures. Simple sentences are made of one independent clause. Example, Delilah gets out of bed. There is a subject and there is a predicate. It is an independent clause. We need no other information. Compound sentences are made of two or more independent clauses joined with a conjunction or punctuation. For example, Delilah wraps presents and Sean bakes cookies. Delilah wraps presents is an independent clause, as is Sean bakes cookies. By joining them together with an and, we've created a compound sentence. Complex sentences are made of an independent clause and a dependent clause. Delilah stays in bed after finding out that school is canceled. Delilah stays in bed is an independent clause because we need to know no other information for it to make sense. After finding out school is canceled is a dependent clause, and if it was on its own, it would not be a full sentence. Compound complex sentences are made of at least two independent clauses and one dependent clause joined with conjunctions or punctuation. For example, Delilah left class early because she was called to the office, but she came back a few minutes later. The two independent clauses in this sentence are Delilah left class early and she came back a few minutes later. Because she was called to the office is the dependent clause because we need more information than is available in this section, but is used to join together the independent and dependent clauses. Now let's look at some fragments and run-ons. A sentence fragment is one or more phrases and or dependent clauses with no independent clause to complete the thought. For example, when I went to the grocer, which had recently been renovated this month in order to add a new deli counter where you can order sandwiches, and stopped to look at the cucumbers. Although this sentence is long, it is still a fragment. Length has nothing to do with whether or not a sentence is a fragment. What it has to do with is if there is an independent clause. If we break down this sentence into clauses and phrases, when I went to the grocer is a dependent clause. I need to know more information. What did I do at the grocer? And stop to look at the cucumbers is also a dependent clause. Who stopped to look at the cucumbers? Why were they looking at cucumbers? There's not enough information here. And then, which had recently been renovated this month in order to add a new deli counter where you can order sandwiches, is just an extremely long prepositional phrase that describes the grocer. Therefore, this is not a complete sentence. This is a sentence fragment because it contains no independent clauses. A run-on sentence is a sentence where two or more independent clauses are not joined with the proper conjunction or punctuation. For example, I ran this morning, it was nice out. This is an extremely short run-on, but it's a run-on nonetheless. A run-on sentence has nothing to do with length. It can be extremely short and still be a run-on. It can be extremely long and still be a run-on. The reason this is a run-on is because I ran this morning is a full, complete thought with a subject and a predicate. It was nice out is also a full, complete thought with a subject and a predicate. One way we could fix something like this is simply put a period after morning and capitalize the I in it, so it becomes two separate sentences. I ran this morning. It was nice out. There are also ways you could fix it with conjunctions, like I ran this morning because it was nice out. Now let's practice some fragments and run-ons. Identify why the examples below are sentence fragments and write a new sentence fixing the mistakes. Remember, a fragment is one or more phrases and or dependent clauses with no independent clause to complete the thought. Pause the video until you're ready to move on. Here are a few ways you might have corrected these sentence fragments and made them full sentences. Double check your work. Are any of them still in need of an independent clause? Let's go over these together. He worked in the factory all day, waiting to come home and see his dog. By adding the pronoun he, we've put a subject in this clause, which otherwise merely had a predicate. Worked in the factory all day. In the factory all day is part of the predicate that describes worked, the verb. Therefore, by adding a subject, this becomes a full thought. Waiting to come home and see his dog is just another dependent clause added on to the end. There were a bunch of toys and books scattered around the room. Again, all we've done here is we've taken a dependent clause and added either the subject or the predicate to make it an independent clause. Toys and books scattered around the room was the subject, and now we have there were, which is the predicate, the verb. It's a state of being and therefore a verb. Because it was a sunny day, I had been itching for a run all morning. All we did here was remove the conjunction and. Without it, because it was a sunny day and I had been itching for a run all morning, the second part of that sentence becomes a dependent clause, and because the first part of that sentence is already a dependent clause, it becomes two dependent clauses. But by removing the and, the first part of this sentence stays a dependent clause, but then we get the independent clause, I had been itching for a run all morning. We need no other information in that part of the sentence, and therefore it's an independent clause. Now let's work on some run-ons. Identify the examples below are run-on sentences and write a new sentence fixing the mistakes. Remember, a run-on is a sentence where two or more independent clauses are not joined with the proper conjunction or punctuation. Pause the video until you're ready to move on. Here are a few ways you might have corrected these run-on sentences and made them full sentences. Double check your work. Are any of them still in need of separation with a conjunction or punctuation? Let's look at them together. I got locked out of my house. My neighbor kicked my door down. By adding a semicolon, we have separated the two independent clauses, I got locked out of my house, and my neighbor kicked my door down. Another way to fix this might have been putting an and. Ted's favorite sandwich is a spicy chicken club. It is tangy. All we did here was insert a period after club and capitalize the I and it to create two independent clauses. The student studied hard for his test while his wife slept soundly. All we did here was between test and his, we've inserted a conjunction, making two independent clauses joined with a conjunction. Now let's talk about some commonly misused punctuation. A comma is used to separate a phrase or dependent clause indicate a pause in part of a sentence, or represent separate items in a list. For example, after she ate, she wasn't feeling very good. After she ate is a dependent clause on she wasn't feeling very good, which is an independent clause. So by putting a comma in there, we've separated the dependent and the independent clause. A colon is used to introduce a list of terms, quote, or explanation/definition of a term. For example, what he brought on the trip was merely this: a tent, a hatchet, and a fire starter. By putting the colon after the this, we've created a separation so the list stands out more clearly. A semicolon is used to join two independent clauses without a conjunction, and for complicated lists where commas are used in individual entries in the list. If we go back and look at our run-on sentences, our first example, I got locked out of my house, my neighbor kicked my door down, is an example of how to use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses. This is an example of how to use a semicolon in a list. On her bird-watching tour, she saw a small, ruby-throated hummingbird, a huge, loud cardinal, and several funny little birds she couldn't identify. Because there was a comma between small and ruby-throated and huge and loud, a semicolon is appropriate to use for a list because otherwise somebody reading the list might get lost as to the parts of the clauses that are meant to be together. Now let's practice. Read the sentences below and decide if any of them need commas, colons, or semicolons. If they do, add them. Pause the video until you're ready to move on. Here are a few ways to fix the sentences that needed fixing using commas, colons, and semicolons. Did you add any where it wasn't necessary? How might you fix these sentences using conjunctions or other types of punctuation? Let's go over these together. Maria is always hungry. She keeps snacks in a bag at all times. Maria is always hungry is an independent clause, and she keeps snacks in a bag at all times is also an independent clause. Therefore, by adding a semicolon, we take this from a run-on sentence to a compound sentence. Barry finally brought home fresh groceries from the market: milk, eggs, and vegetables. In this one, we used commas to separate out the items in a list, the milk, the eggs, and the vegetables, and we also used a colon to indicate when the list began. Groceries from the market. It was a tough day for everyone at the factory because they had a lot of orders to fill. In this one, no changes were needed. It was a tough day for everyone at the factory is an independent clause. They had a lot of orders to fill is an independent clause, and we've joined them not with punctuation, but with a conjunction. Because. Therefore, no extra punctuation is needed. However, if this sentence read, because they had a lot of orders to fill, it was a tough day for everyone at the factory, we would need a comma. And the reason for that is because any time you begin a sentence with a conjunction, there needs to be a comma separating out the first clause. Because she was new in town, she didn't know many people. For this one, we only needed a comma, for the same reason as number 3. Because is a conjunction, and if we start a sentence with a conjunction, we must have a comma after the first clause. Henry decided he would go this far and no further. For this, no commas are needed. Some people might be inclined to put a comma after far, because when we say this sentence aloud, we naturally pause there. Henry decided he would go this far and no further. The reason this isn't necessary is because we have joined the independent clause, he would go this far, with a dependent clause, no further, with a conjunction, and. So we don't need any additional commas there. If you still feel like you need help with grammar and sentence structure essentials, feel free to come to the Writing Center at the Academic Resource Center. You can get a one-on-one session with a tutor and we can help answer any questions you may still have.